everyone to the continuation of the 2018 Wilderness Lecture Series. Our title this year is The Rivers Will Run, a celebration of 50 years of the National Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. This week we're continuing our theme on our lecture series with a talk titled Stories Run Through It, 5,000 Miles of Wild and Our Connections to Wild Rivers. This is going to be presented by Mike Fiebig, who's the Associate Director of the Northern Rockies Office of American Rivers. In this position, he leads river conservation efforts in the Northern Rockies and the Intermountain West, focusing on public lands policy, grassroots advocacy, and the protection of wild rivers, often utilizing the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. Prior to working at American Rivers, Mike was a Presidential Management Fellow focused on climate change mitigation in the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem as well as abroad. He's been a commercial river guide and outdoor educator for over 20 years. He earned his master's in science and natural resource policy and conflict resolution here at the University of Montana in the Environmental Studies program. And he holds a bachelor's in neuroscience and BA in philosophy from Michigan State University. He currently lives in Bozeman, Montana with his wife and their dog. And I know that many of these talks, especially students ask towards the end, I feel like a question that always comes up is, well, what can I do to get involved? And how is it that I can be a part of these larger national or international level campaigns? And one of the reasons why I brought Mike into the lecture series this year is because he's going to give you some really concrete ways in which you can engage, as well as how he's engaging in this as an individual as well. So with that, I'd like to welcome Mike to our lecture series. Thanks.
Thanks, Natalie. Let me see if I can turn this mic on. You all can probably hear me without it. I'm pretty loud. Okay, is it on now? It is. Now I've got to try to be careful not to blow you out with my loud voice. Let's see if we can get this thing to work too. All right, so thank you for having me. Pleased to be here again, and thank you all for coming out tonight. And I know some of you have to because you're in the class, but thank you anyways for not skipping. My name is Mike Fiebig, and for those of you who don't know American Rivers, who I work for, it's a national nonprofit that focuses on river conservation. It protects wild rivers, restores damaged rivers, and conserves clean water for people and the environment. So it started over 40 years ago in Denver, Colorado, by a bunch of kayakers sitting around saying, okay, why aren't there more rivers in the National Wild and Scenic River System? We need to do something about this. Since then, it's grown into a much larger org, and we have folks that remove dams. We're the largest nonprofit dam removal organization in the country. We're involved with removing 86 dams across the nation last year. And then we have folks that work on clean water in urban environments. Luckily, and probably not a surprise to you all, up here in the Northern Rockies, we're lucky enough to work on protecting wild rivers, which we have an abundance of. So I'm happy to be here, happy to talk about wild rivers. And tonight's all going to be about telling stories. And forgive me, I'm a policy wonk. I'm someone that sits in front of a computer that works with the federal government on forest plan revisions. I go back and forth to DC and try to get those folks to work on behalf of wild rivers. But the story piece is really important, and it's why we do our work. It's why lawmakers do work on behalf of us. And we're going to delve into some stories tonight. Speaking of stories, I walked over from the Doubletree tonight to get here. And on the ice next to the Clark Fork were a bunch of river otter tracks. How many folks here have seen river otters in the Clark Fork? Yeah, nice. So when I lived in Missoula, we didn't see river otters in the Clark Fork. But what do you think's changed since I lived in Missoula? Yeah, the dam's gone. Pretty awesome. It was really, really, really cool to see that on the way here. So, just in time, so I was going to say, I do have a colleague here. So our Northern Rockies office is based out of Bozeman, and there are a couple of us over here or over there. And then Cassie Heron, who just walked in,
I'm really sorry.
That's all right.
My
It's cool. Cassie's my colleague over here, and she was still getting food and drinks with my wife, so that's all right. But Cassie's here. You'll probably see her around. She's also an alum from University of Montana. So let's see if I can get this thing to switch. There we go. So a little bit about me. Not that I want to talk about myself a ton, but it's good to hear where people are coming from. I got into conservation through adventure, through recreation, as some of you may be doing or may have done already. So my story is that I grew up in Michigan, and while I was in undergrad, I developed a penchant for rock climbing. And I didn't know what I was going to do after undergrad, but I knew I wanted to move to the West. So I applied for a bunch of scholarships to the University of Colorado, went there to study philosophy and mostly fuel my rock climbing habit. And to say that I was poor in Boulder was an understatement. And it got to be spring break, and everyone was going off on these amazing adventures, and I didn't have one. So I was sitting at my job, and I was reading a paper, and I answered a WAN ad, and I didn't know if I wanted to be a raft guide, but I knew I wanted to go on a 5-day Upper Salt River trip for $150 for guide interview training. I was like, oh, I don't want to be a raft guide, but now I know what I'm going to do over spring break. So I applied and I did that, and just on a whim, and it changed my life. I got addicted to boating. I got addicted to wild rivers. The Upper Salt is one of the few rivers in Arizona that remains wild, that's boatable. Everything else has been plumbed. And it started, I came back to school after my break. I got hired on by the raft company, and then I took a leave of absence from grad school, and I never went back that time. And I started this 10-year odyssey of living out of a vehicle and guiding rafts all over North America. And then that brought me to outdoor education, because I wanted to give a little more back. And then watching that change over the course of those 10 years, watching some of the public lands change, made me want to come to the University of Montana and get a degree to help work on conservation of wild rivers. So that one ad made all the difference for me. It changed my whole life and brought me here today. So I wanted to share that with you. These are just some photos of some of what I do when I'm not sitting in front of a computer doing policy with my wife and dog. So why wild rivers? Why are wild rivers important? You've probably been hearing from a bunch of folks. I don't know Charlie Ray. I know Tim Palmer quite well. He's awesome. There are a bunch of reasons why to conserve wild rivers. And they range from the scientific, wild rivers are our baseline for natural flows. Wild rivers, undammed rivers, still have a natural hydrograph. In the Intermountain West here, they peak in the spring with snowmelt, and they're at their lowest usually in early fall. And a number of species have timed their life cycles according to those flows. They provide clean, cold water in copious amounts sometimes of the year and not in others. They provide silt and sediment. They do sediment transport. And some interesting research that goes on here with Rick Hauer, they provide this amazing gravel bed ecosystem in the Intermountain West too. So there are a bunch of scientific reasons for maintaining the baselines of wild rivers. There are also historic reasons. Wild rivers were our original highways in the Intermountain West. They were the paths of least resistance. Water seeks a steady state. And because of that, if you want to travel through the West, originally, you wanted to follow rivers. And because of that as well, a lot of sacred sites and historic sites, both Native American and afterwards, are along rivers. And then culture. In modern days, there are some things that we get from wild rivers, some feelings we get, some connections we get to the species that still inhabit wild rivers that have been there since pre-Columbian times that we don't get other places. For me in my life, interacting with wild rivers is the only time I get to interact with such a dynamic natural system. And whether I'm doing work out there, or whether I'm paddling and playing out there. It's an almost spiritual experience for me. And we're going to hear some about that tonight with some of the stories I'm going to read to you. And that's the Maine salmon. So, dams. So the opposite of a wild river is an impounded river. And right now we have over 90,000 dams in the United States. They're cataloged and inventoried in the National Inventory of Dams by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. And in Montana alone, we have over 2,900 dams. So to get a sense of what 90,000 dams is, that's as if we built one dam per day since Thomas Jefferson was president. Let that sink in. One dam per day. So we're still building dams, and I'm not saying dams are wrong either. You know, dams impact about 600,000 miles of river in the United States. But they also feed crucial cropland. They create hydroelectricity in a lot of places that they didn't have that before. They provide municipal drinking water as well. So there are a bunch of good things about dams. As we're going to see, though, the reason that the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act came along was for a balance between rivers that are impounded, like those you see there, and rivers that are free-flowing. So we had some of those left. And, as you've probably heard a bunch, so you've heard a lot about the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act already, but just so that we're all on the same page, we're going to go over some of the same stuff again, so that people that are just joining us tonight understand what it does. It was passed in 1968, so 50 years ago this October, and it was meant to be that balance between development and wild, free-flowing rivers. Right now there are, just over 12,000 miles of protected rivers, 208 sections. If you ask Tim Palmer, there are more than that because he counts the individual tributaries. I don't know if he talked about that, and he has a really good point. But as far as the legislation goes, there are 208 in 39 states. And that's less than 0.25% of rivers in the U.S. One of them is shown in the background here, and the tie to Montana, for those of you that are probably hearing this again, is that the John and Frank Craighead grizzly bear biologists, who are world famous and well known for their work in Greater Yellowstone and the Northern Continental Divide ecosystem, started their career in protecting wild rivers, trying to save this river you see in the background. That's the middle fork of the Flathead River in what is now the Great Bear Wilderness. And at the time, right down there at Spruce Park Rapid, there was a dam proposed. Has anyone here been to the Hungry Horse Dam? Just one drainage south. So this was going to be a mirror to Hungry Horse. It was going to be over 500 feet tall. It was going to back up the middle fork of the Flathead 11 miles. And for the Craigheads, this is about, some of the most fecund wildlife habitat in the area. So they started popularizing this idea that we need a system of protected rivers, protected wild rivers in the country. And they first mentioned that in 1957 at a conference at Montana State University in Bozeman. We have 3 other wild and scenic rivers here in Montana. This one, the North Fork of the Flathead. This one, the Upper Missouri Breaks. And this one, the South Fork of the Flathead. There are 3 main things that the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act does. So again, we've got to get this baseline. Protects free-flowing character, and often days, compared to the big dam that you saw on the previous slide, that's Glen Canyon Dam, what we're protecting against these days is usually smaller dams like this, run-of-the-river hydropower projects. So a small dam like that can go in, the water goes into, let's see if this thing works, goes into this house here and goes through a multi-mile pipeline, goes through a penstock downriver, and creates hydropower. Unfortunately, for the stretch of river that's right here, in high water, the water flows over, and in low water, that stretch gets dewatered. So that's what we're protecting against often now. These are much cheaper than these once were. Water quality must be maintained or enhanced. And a suite of outstandingly remarkable values must be protected, maintained or enhanced. And this is where each wild and scenic designation is unique. So these values, there has to be at least one, but there can be many layered on top of one another. And there are values like scenery, like paddling recreation, wildlife habitat, fisheries habitat, cultural values, historic values. And the way Congress wrote it is that, or any other similar value. So we have some really interesting values out there. I think it's the Merrimack River in New England has a literary value. You should look it up. This is the Smith River, by the way, one of the rivers we're hoping to protect here in Montana, too. So federal water right is authorized with a priority date of the date of passage. So say East Rosebud Creek, which was on the title slide of this presentation, passes this next year. It might be the first new wild and scenic designation in Montana in over 40 years. Say it passes next year and it doesn't have a federal water right on it. It's authorized to receive one with the priority date of that year, so 2019. So it's a junior water right for folks here that are water right geeks and policy geeks like I am. It gets a junior right. Oftentimes, these streams have federal reserved water rights on them anyways. The Forest Service has been doing a lot of work, in particular in Region 1, to get federal reserved rights for in-stream flows. So this doesn't have to set the clock back on that. The existing flow can take precedent. A comprehensive river management plan is created for every river. And the way the law reads is that within 3 years of designation. And that's a public process through the National Environmental Policy Act. And for those of you who have done the Middle Fork of the salmon in the summer, this is a great shuttle to put in on a busy day. It's a good thing they have a management plan in place. So a few things that the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act doesn't do. I just want to go through and say what it does do and what it doesn't do really succinctly. It doesn't affect private property development unless there's a federal permit required, and that would affect those outstandingly remarkable values. So if your project needed federal authorization, if it was on public land, or if it was a federally authorized or a project that required federal authorization and it potentially affected those outstanding values, scenery, recreation, wildlife, then it could affect that development. So would it stop you from building your house? Probably not. Would it stop you? Well, definitely not. Would it stop you from putting in a mine that would discharge water into a wild and scenic river? Probably would, or at least require you to mitigate it extensively. So doesn't affect existing water rights or interstate water compacts. It doesn't say anything really about motorized or mechanized activities. But if they did harm those outstandingly remarkable values, you could expect the agency to curb them. But it's one of the reasons that this type of designation is a little more flexible than, say, a wilderness designation, because it allows, at least in certain classifications of wild and scenic rivers, motorized and mechanized activities. Doesn't change public or private access any more than any other public land designation does, and it doesn't say anything about hunting or fishing regulations. Those are still reserved for the state. If we sized the wild and scenic rivers in a cartogram across the country, this is what it would look like. And you can see that, our winners here are Alaska, Oregon, and California. Montana is about the same size as Pennsylvania and New Jersey and Michigan. Idaho is doing a bit better next to us. But this is what we've got. This is our system in a cartogram. That's coming out a little fuzzy, but I just wanted to mention really quickly, because Cassie has some information on this if folks want to get involved. There is a coalition in Montana called Montanans for Healthy Rivers. We've been working for about 7 years to bring new wild and scenic designations that Montanans want to see for some of their last wild rivers. Check it out. It's hard to see here, but the bulk of them are around the Crown of the Continent and Greater Yellowstone. With a few here, there's Rock Creek just east of Missoula. There's the Smith River, but the rest are all in the Crown or Greater Yellowstone. So now we get to the meat of things, even though I talked for a long time already. So there's a group of organizations and companies and others that are coming together to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. There are a couple groups doing this. So I should say there's a larger group of all the federal agencies that manage wild and scenic rivers in partnership with a number of us river nonprofits. And then there's a few of us river nonprofits doing our own thing called 5,000 Miles of Wild as well. And that's led by American Rivers and American Whitewater. And then there are some other folks that are involved too, folks like Knowles, and then a lot of companies like NRS and ORS and others. But the whole idea behind 5,000 Miles of Wild is that we had a conservation goal of protecting 5,000 new miles of river for the 50th, and that's both designations and administrative protections. Most of them, as you can imagine, are administrative protections, especially with our current political climate, but we are getting some new designations. And then to collect 5,000 stories of wild rivers and to post them in a place that people such as yourselves or lawmakers or others can find them. And the piece that I want to talk to you tonight is that second piece. It's those 5,000 stories, the stories of, what rivers do for people, what people find special and touching and connecting about wild rivers. And I've got a number of these that I'm going to read to you tonight. So bear with me. Like I said, I'm usually a policy wonk, but I'm going to be a storyteller this evening. And I'm going to have to stop and drink some water now and then, too. The first photo that's going to come up here, so each one is a story and a photo. And you can find all of these on the 5000miles.org website, too, along with hundreds of others. But these are just some of them that jumped out at me. So the first one is one of the most, sometimes a picture really is worth 1,000 words. It's one of the more famous pictures in river running. And this is shot by Rudy Pecek, who, folks that have read the Emerald Mile, he was featured in there. And this was during the same year that they did the fastest run through the Grand Canyon. So this was submitted by Mike Taggett. And it's written in the third person, but I'm going to read it anyways. So in 1983, Mike Taggett, the founder of Chums, was embarking upon his third year as a boatman with Martin Litton's Grand Canyon Dories in the Grand Canyon. A dory trip down the Colorado was 18 to 22 days back then, and Litton ran his operation with beautiful painted wooden dories, fast, responsive, and easy to right in the event of a flip. Spring of 1983 marked the end of a tremendous snow season, resulting in high and fast runoff from the Colorado mountains. Lake Powell was at capacity with the risk of overflowing, forcing the opening of spillways from Glen Canyon Dam. Downriver, the water ran at more than double its normal flow, measuring 40,000 CFS and above. And to pause here, CFS is cubic feet per second. For those who aren't river runners, that's how we measure volume. You can think of each cubic foot per second. Each cubic foot is about the size of a basketball. So 40,000 basketballs per second going by. Rates that had never been seen since before the dam was built. By the time Mike's trip got to Lava Falls, it was running at almost 100,000 CFS. The current ran fast all the way to shore, and it was hard just to make it into the eddies for some of the camps. Throughout the trip, the Park Service dropped notes from helicopters with high water warnings and river closure notices. Passengers had no idea why the guides were a bit jittery, as most of the rapids weren't big, but the water was incredibly fast. Not many can say they experienced those epic days on the Colorado in 1983, and Taggett is lucky to have been part of that piece of history on that river that will never likely be repeated again. Pretty amazing photo. And a Photoshop version of this appears on the cover of Emerald Mile. So often, though, it's the little things that get people. It's not the big, giant 100,000 CFS lava falls. So I should say that as you see the titles, it's the title that people entered on the website. It's the photo they entered. And then it's supposed to be their favorite river next to them that you see next to their name. So Nick says, some of my favorite memories that I have with my sister are paddling on Sugar Creek during our church's annual youth retreat. We grew up canoeing on lakes, so the change of pace and ever-changing scenery offered by paddling on the river was always a treat. The little things stick out the best. Seeing my first kingfisher, stopping for lunch at a gravel bar, watching turtles swim in the shallow water. While the Midwest may lack the grandeur of mountains or the awe-inspiring power of the ocean, it has a subtle beauty all its own. If you look past the big cities and expansive fields of corn, there are still little pockets of wilderness to be found, many of them along rivers. And that's true. If you go into the more developed areas of the country, sometimes the only wildness that's left is along rivers. Just like my memories of Sugar Creek, it's the little things that shine brightest in the Midwest. A bobolink alighting on a stalk of Indian grass, the fragrant smell of siliphium flower, tall coreopsis swaying in a gentle prairie breeze. May there forever be rivers like Sugar Creek to help us find these little wonders. I chose that one because it's not a creek that any of us would know, but we all have those creeks in our history. And then we got some great historical photos too. Family figures heavily into a lot of the photos, or stories, go figure. So Jesse writes, my dad was a river guide on the Colorado for 11 years, and when he met my mom down there, his love for her and the river grew deeper than the canyon itself. You guys are my Grand Canyon, is what he told my brother, sister, and I. The river is the reason for my family's existence. It brought two beautiful souls together that I can proudly call my parents. Thank you, Mom and Dad, for loving us endlessly and helping guide us through the rapids of life. So the healing power of wild rivers is a big theme too. And as you'll see from this one, Jan in Restoring Our Souls. And of course, this is the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, the designated Kongakut Wild and Scenic River up there. And it's a special place if you can get up there. You should ask Natalie about it. So we flew from Fairbanks over the Arctic Circle to the small native town of Arctic Village in June, just as the days become longest. We met our bush plane there, and after loading our gear, took off into the Brooks Range, landing on a sandbar far, far away from what others call civilization. The air was clear, the river rapid, and the work of setting up camp was deeply satisfying. We spent one night at our landing site before blowing up our rafts and heading downriver toward the Beaufort Sea. We were in search, not just of caribou, as they headed for calving grounds, but of our best selves. In the end, we found both. We found peace. These rivers have to be protected. They're our salvation and our responsibility. And this one, I think, tells us about how wild rivers in our lives really become part of us. This one's called Living or Missing Rivers. Today I finally found a few extra, and you all might, some of the students here might relate to this. Today I finally found a few extra hours after class and drove up Boulder Canyon to fish. I parked my car, rigged my rod, and walked a little way down to Boulder Creek, where I made 2 casts before a fish hit my fly. This is what I had been missing. I started to think about my time in the Roaring Fork Valley between Glenwood Springs and Aspen. I spent a good part of my childhood there, camping with my family, playing in open fields with my brother and our dog, walking through groves of aspen trees, and fishing. The Frying Pan River in particular is a part of me. I learned to fish there, I grew up there, I always return there. How many times have my dad and I driven up and down that windy road, singing along to Jimmy Buffett, gazing off at an iron-red 7 castles. My dad always tells me with a little chuckle that when he dies, he wants to be cremated and thrown in the frying pan. These rivers are more than just nature. They're memories, history. There's a reason why the confluence of the Little Colorado is a sacred place to the Paiute people. There's a reason why Clear Creek County makes tens of millions of dollars every summer just through the rafting industry. There's a reason why the Roaring Fork and Frying Pan are iconic rivers for fly fishermen. Don't fight the river, my mentor always told me. Rivers are an allegory for life, always moving, always flowing, always reaching new places, and they've shaped who I am. So this next one, I know what's coming. I put up here with the title with a little trepidation, but I think once you hear it, the shock will be explained. So a little pre-story for this. River guides have always been somewhat of a countercultural, irreverent force in the world, not least of which is reflective in the nicknames they sometimes get. This story is about the young woman you see on the left who has passed away now. Her name was Chris Raffin. CR were her initials, hence Chicken Raper. During guide training, so where this comes from, this is kind of a legendary story, but I'll read what the folks wrote too. During the guide training, a leaking down sleeping bag left her consistently covered with feathers every morning. And so because of her initials, they started calling her Chicken Raper because she was always covered with these down feathers. The nickname stuck, and you'll hear the story about the homage these folks wrote. Rig to Flip is a production company down in Colorado, and they focus a lot of their work on the Dolores River, which is critically endangered. So Chris Raffin, seen here in a river kitchen, was a pioneering young river guide during the 1970s. She logged miles on the Yampa, the North Platte, the Upper Colorado, Cataract Canyon, Arkansas, and Dolores rivers. At the time, it was standard for river guides to have nicknames. Chris is being more unique than others in her crowd. Chicken Raper. It's funny, I used to guide on the Dolores, and we never called this rapid, which you're going to hear about, by Chicken Raper. We called it State Line because of the shock of the name. So Chris was ultimately bestowed the highest honor of any river runner by having a rapid named after her, and was later inducted into the Boatman's Hall of Fame. In May of 1975, Chris was guiding with a company contracted to conduct a wild and scenic study trip on the Dolores, the first river in Colorado to be studied for inclusion in the National Wild and Scenic River System, and among the first in the nation to be studied. She was guiding a paddle rig with BLM Fish and Wildlife staff through the largest rapid on the Dolores, State Line Rapid, a solid Class 4. One of the BLM guides had fallen out on the upper section, ensuring a life-threatening swim through the rapid. Chris was able to fetch the swimmer and successfully navigate her team through another mile of difficult white water to safety. It was her first time running State Line Rapid. Since then, the rapid has become known as Chicken Raper in honor of Chris. For us, the name is a melding of heritage and history, a badass young woman riding a once wild river, a river nominated but never designated for inclusion in the National Wild and Scenic River System. Chris Raffin lost her life to cancer in 1983, the same year the Dolores River was dammed by McPhee Reservoir. For others, rivers are no less than an integral part of their livelihoods and cultural histories. So this is by Aaron Cloud. I'm setting my gill net out on a sandbar to clean it. Once clean, I'll paddle it back up into the Trinity River to reset it. Spring to early summer and late summer to the end of fall are prime fishing on the reservation. In the morning, you'll see copious amounts of boats and families up and down the river checking their gill nets. The river is our livelihood on the reservation. It's how we teach our children not only to fish, but the importance of our natural resources, benevolence toward elders, compassion for wildlife, and sustainability for the earth. I just love this because there are so many different stories on this side. I just pulled a few out, but these are all just people pulling this up and writing something that's super personal to them. And I hope you all will too after this. So, another enduring theme is the break from technology that wild rivers and wild places give us. So Phil writes, In these days of 24-hour news, cell phones, Google Maps, soft beds, and central air and heat, maybe the best thing about Wild and Scenic Rivers is the chance of having a true outdoor adventure and experience nature in its natural form. At times, you don't see any other people or have any contact with the outside world for hours or even days. It's a chance to truly enjoy nature and contemplate your place in the world. What brings people back to rivers? For some, it may be the adrenaline rush of running rapids. For others, it is the wilderness experience. Some enjoy the food, but for those that return year after year, it's the chance to share these experiences with their river family. For others, it gets more personal. For those of you that guide in the room or have taken people out in the wilderness or on wild rivers for the first time, like the gentleman pictured, he made profound changes in his life. Matt Culver writes, "I was a workaholic. I had been working many large engineering projects 6 days a week, no vacations, for 7 years or so. When one of the projects was near completion, I felt the project could survive without me. I took a 13-day trip down the Colorado and the Grand Canyon. Going down the canyon, I felt the stress just draining out of me. One day, floating down the river, I was looking up at the canyon walls, the blue sky, and muddy water. I just started sobbing. It was so beautiful. Now, I'm a big guy, and I'm not one for emotional outbursts. However, the canyon was the most beautiful thing I had seen in my life. After I got back to work, I never fell back into my workaholic mode. I always used every minute of my vacation time. I always tried to do at least one whitewater trip every year. I changed. I also retired early. I'm a different person than I was before I went down the Grand Canyon." For others, rivers have been a muse for ages. Lake Carter writes, "Who doesn't love rivers? I stood ankle deep in mud to paint this scene along the St. Croix River. Any activity along or in a river is wonderfully soothing to the soul. I love painting river scenes because you become so immersed in the experience of gentle movement and colorful reflections. The organic twists and turns in rivers reveal peaks of bluff and forests ahead. The last sunlight of the day illuminating treetops and soft reflections on the water mesmerizes and teaches me how to be in life, soft, cool, and reflective." So what do you think? Liking stories? Good. Every once in a while, you'll find writers as well as painters. If folks recognize this guy, he's the guy that wrote the Emerald Mile, Kevin Fedarko. And Kevin writes on our Grand Canyon theme, "There's no place that I know of like the Grand Canyon. It exposes larger truths about who we are and who we need to become if we are to develop a more harmonious and balanced relationship with the places that we live and the places we call home. Beauty means something. It's more than just an abstract idea. It strikes at the core of who we are as a people. It's bedrock. It's one of those things that can sustain us." And sometimes there's heartbreak. There are a few stories of loss on the site. And here's one that's not as hard as some of the others. We were about halfway through a 24-day trip on the Omo River when one of my coworkers was becoming increasingly more ill. We were running out of options and were considering calling the U.S. Embassy for a heli flight. We decided to push on one more day to go down to where work was started on the Guibé Dam. The dam was being built by an Italian contracting firm, and we were hoping they would have a Western medical clinic. We approached the dam site in our 4 rafts, and the workers looked shocked. Robo, our translator for the trip, got on shore and proceeded to explain who we were and what we needed. The workers went and got the bosses, and the Italians were more than helpful to take our sick person into their clinic for treatment. That night, while lying on the shore next to what in a few years would kill this river, yet possibly provide much needed electricity for Ethiopia and Kenya, was rather confusing. I just couldn't grasp what was right. And sometimes those inspirations lead to actions. Bringing it back home here to Montana. Steve Quarles writes, when I worked on the Senate Natural Resources Committee in the 1970s, there was talk of erecting a dam that would have flooded the Missouri River breaks in Montana. The committee held a hearing on the river's future in Montana, and following the hearing, I and 2 other committee staffers floated the Missouri breaks with Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, a Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks employee who was an expert on the river. For several days and nights, the river champion said nothing about the potential impoundment. Then on the last night around the campfire at sunset, he asked us to look up at the alpenglow near the top of a cliff face across the river. Then he quietly said, "That's where the water will be." I have never encountered a more powerful, truly heartfelt, and extraordinarily efficient and effective lobbying moment. Just 5 words in 2 seconds were enough. My colleagues and I returned to DC and wrote the bill that designated Missouri Breaks as a wild and scenic river, forever protecting it from new dams. Power of stories. On a lighter note, sometimes rivers allow kids to be kids. Amy writes, my family has a long history with this gem of a river in northern Wisconsin. A family tradition is to put in at Stones Bridge in the late afternoon and lazily fish to a secret landing. There we cook some food and drink some coffee laced with Baileys. We put back into the water as the last tendrils of light fade from the sky and fish our way down the river in the dark until the moon rises and makes shadows out of the cedars. On one particular trip, I was in a canoe with my brother Tim. There had been a thunderstorm as we put into Hidden Landing, and now as we entered the stretch of river called Big Lake, it was eerily calm, with mist forming along the edges of the river and trees reaching toward the moon. The moon was full and bright, and we felt naked out in the middle of the widest part of the river. Silence. I whispered, "This is where the creature rises from the depths and pulls us down." At that precise moment, when I finished my sentence, a huge I'm messing this one up. A huge trout jumped out of the water, waggled in the moonlight, and plunged back into the river with a thwap. I yelled and fell off the back of my seat, and my brother screamed. Our fright turned into hysterical giggling, and fishing was done for the night. One of my favorite memories. And then another funny story. So Will here, he titles it, "I Asked My Fiancée to Marry Me in the Grand Canyon." He doesn't talk about that at all in his story. And if you look at the bottom of the photo, that's not his photo either. He posted someone else's photo. But his story is good. He says, "I've loved rivers since I was a young man. My dad was a riverboat captain on the Mississippi River between New Orleans and Baton Rouge. My grandfather was, and so was my great-grandfather. I am 4th in the generation of river pilots, but I pilot whitewater. I learned how to guide when I was 19 at the Feather River College in Northern California in Quincy. While I was there at my guide school, we were kayaking the South Fork of the Feather River. The plan was that we were going to kayak the section, and at the takeout, we were going to use our buddy's Jeep as the shuttle vehicle. So it was a great day on the water. We get to the takeout, and it was really cold, and we were trying to find the keys to the Jeep that my buddy had hidden. But they weren't there. They weren't where he had said they were. But luckily, we were able to find a stick and jack the lock open, and there was a key in the center console. As we drove along, we were thinking about how nice his Jeep was and how lucky we were to find an extra key. When we got to our friend's campsite, he told us that it wasn't his Jeep. So we realized we'd stolen someone else's vehicle, and no one wanted to take it back. So we finally did take it back to the takeout. The owner wasn't there. We put it back where it was parked, and then we saw the funky old Jeep that we were supposed to take. And then there are the campsites. Oh, the campsites. Darius writes, "Some days just work out," and this was one of them. The last night on my first trip down the Middle Fork of the Salmon River. This camp had been closed to reservations due to fire on the day we launched, but we found out at the Middle Fork Lodge that restrictions had just been lifted. It was a hot August afternoon, so when we floated around the corner and found this beautiful shady beach, it was too good to pass up. Cocktails on the cool sugar sand, the splendor of this view, good friends, and a river rolling by made this a cherished memory. Millions of years in the making, this place is truly a natural work of art, a pristine chapel. And then I put this one in because it reminds me of the play wave in downtown Missoula right here. It's nothing like a river in the morning. Adele writes, in Columbia, South Carolina, we are so lucky to have the Saluda River that flows through our downtown. When I lived there, I would sometimes wake up early before work and go paddle with friends for a dawn patrol. There's nothing like the river in the morning when the mist is rising and the birds are just waking up. But the river is just as strong, as playful as she always is. I love it, and I'm so thankful for those memories that are full of joy, peace, and anticipation, looking forward to what each day can bring. Got two more. So this one's about family and legacy. Steve writes, my grandfather introduced me to rivers when I was 5 by buying me a pair of LL Bean boots and letting me explore the magical muddy floodplain adjoining his cattle ranch along the Sacramento River. My father deepened that connection by standing side by side and chest deep with me, teaching me to fly fish on the Trinity, Maurice, and the Gallatin. There's no way my wife would have married me if I hadn't been able to woo her for 22 days on the Colorado in the bottom of the Grand Canyon. I've been fortunate to be able to share wild rivers and timeless moments with my 2 sons during annual float trips on the Rogue, Salmon, and Green. Whenever I can, I go alone to the Tuolumne to look for fish and find myself and peace. Without rivers, I'd be a pale, lonely, single internet troll with, with no boots, no children, and no connection to our planet. I imagine that my grandfather's grandfather introduced him to rivers. I can't imagine my grandchildren's grandchildren not having that opportunity. He outlines just what's at stake here. Internet trolls. And finally, there are those that are lucky enough to work on rivers. And Steve is a ranger on the Missouri River Breaks. And he wrote this poem at the end of the season. Last night, the wild geese called all night, their November song urgent in my dreams. It's time to leave this hawk-hunted prairie and the wind harping in these cottonwoods. Leave this vastness of light and its lens of polished air. Leave this silent sandstone and the sacred text on this bone-scattered ground. Leave even this endless, beginningless river. I'll carry away from this place a little less than my whole heart. Thanks, Steve. And then the whole point of this is for you all to share your stories. When we leave here and at the end of this season, and if you are listening to these and you're like, I don't have a river story, rivers haven't been as much a part of me, you live in an amazing state to go make some river stories this next summer. And this is the way you can share them. So if you look up 5000miles.org, you can post a photo, write your story just like all of these folks have, and share them. And when you do that, since you're going to have to write it anyways, keep a separate copy and share that with your land managers, with your congressional representatives, with those who make decisions on your public lands. So when I was a river ranger on the Upper Salt River in Arizona, so a little story from me again, back in the early 2000s. The Upper Salt's a wild river. It's not designated as wild and scenic though. And it was managed by the Forest Service, and our district ranger at the time was not as friendly to rivers as he was to local cattle interests. But us as river rangers in the river world, when we got a great letter from someone who loved the Salt River, we could take it up to our district ranger, be like, look, these folks don't want to see, cattle impacting and destroying the riparian zones on this river. They don't want to see oil well pump jacks up on the rim. So good letters to your public land managers are like ammunition that empowers them to often do the things that they want to do anyways, but they need to be able to show that the people they're responsible to want them to do it. Write them, engage them. So when you share your story, make some print-offs of it or throw them in an email and send it to a few people. And if you need to know who to send it to, get in touch with myself or Cassie or Natalie, and we can put you in touch with your congressional delegation too. Another little story about coming back to us. So on the theme of making river stories, my wife and I, so I've been working for American Rivers for almost 7 years. It'll be 7 years this summer. And I'm lucky enough to work for an organization that gives me a sabbatical every 7 years. And so for our sabbatical, we're going to descend the full Green and Colorado River system from the Wind River Range in Wyoming to the Gulf of California in Mexico. So it's going to take us 5 months. It'll be 1,700 miles. And we're building a whitewater dory to do so right now. And along the way, we'll be cataloging stories of those that we run into. So we'll be recording stories of ranchers we talk to up in Wyoming, land managers at the multiple public lands that we go through, from monuments to parks to forests to BLM lands to wildlife refuges. And then to folks that are houseboating on Lake Havasu, and folks that are working in primarily still subsistence agriculture in the Colorado River Delta in Mexico. Some of you are probably asking, well, you're not going to boat from source to sea because doesn't the Colorado not meet the ocean any longer? And you'd be right. The Colorado doesn't meet the ocean on most years. So for the last 100 miles, when we reach the US-Mexico border, we're going to put the dory aside, we're going to throw on backpacks, and we'll walk the last 100 miles to the ocean. So follow us on our trip. We start in August. Oh, I threw this in there too. So we'll start in the Upper Green, and one of the things that we want to talk about, for those who haven't been to the Green River Lakes in the Wind River Range, the headwaters of the Green River, that's what you'll see. It's spectacular. And it's also threatened by a dam. It's a dam site at a place called Warren Bridge that just doesn't seem to go away. So one of the things we'll be trying to do is make personal some of the threats that are still existent to the Green in Colorado. And there are many. They range from a dam site in the headwaters to, I just found out last week that a developer in the Front Range of Colorado is proposing to pipe a significant portion of the Green River from northeastern Utah across the Rocky Mountains to Fort Collins to fuel development on the Front Range. It'd be a 500-mile pipeline that would cost billions of dollars. So these things are still real. And with the probable impacts from climate change that we're looking at, even Montana, that we haven't had any new big dams in a while, we're going to be seeing more proposals for them in the future. It just may take another 20 years. This is us. This is how you can find us. It's OneRiverManyVoices.com or the One River Expedition if you want to look us up on Facebook or something. But I thought I'd throw that in there because it'll be pretty fun, and our idea is to make some podcasts coming out of it. So we should have, if you like the storytelling aspect or the story listening aspect, there'll be a lot of that in the future. And I promise it won't be me talking. And that's it. This is how you get in touch with me. Feel free to get in touch, and we're going to have some question and answers here. I've heard from Natalie as well, but the whole idea behind stories and this social side is there are a lot of great folks doing science and policy out there for rivers, And for the most part, we know what we need to do to maintain intact ecosystems. There's some great new research out there, but we know what we need to do. The way to get people to do what we need to do is to connect with them, and we connect with them through stories. And that's what I hope you all will take away from tonight. Thanks. So I can take some questions, and it doesn't have to be on, it can be other things related to the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. It can be on threats. It can be on science. Whatever you'd like to throw out. Yeah.
It looked like you had a little sketch of like a sail that you were rigging.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, right up there. This is so maybe do you just want me to explain that?
I was curious about it.
Yeah, so one of the things we want to do, we really want to do the whole thing under human power, except where we get, portaged around dams. And part of that includes rowing 400 miles of reservoir, including 175-mile-long Lake Powell. Lake Powell gets a ton of wind. It gets a lot of fetch. But what I've heard in studying it is that the wind will reverse in the night often as you get in the canyon country. As the canyons heat up during the day, winds are always blowing upstream, not a fun thing. But then as they cool down about 3 in the morning, you get down canyon breezes. So we think if we can rig a sail on our dory, we can probably cover decent miles between 3 a.m. and 9 a.m. And that's our plan to help get us across the reservoir. Thanks. Good observation. So we're working out the design. This is part of it, like, a little jib that we can take up and put down, or a big square sail. Or my friend actually just sent me a site for a parafoil, like a kite, either a kiteboarder or kite skier would use. So. We're looking for whatever help we can get. Thanks. Yeah.
Dog going with you?
Yeah, good question. So the question was, is the dog coming with us? And she is for the first part. So she'll join us on the upper green for about the first month or so. We plan to actually, our backup up there is if the upper green is too low, we're going to canoe it. And our dog's been on a lot of multi-day canoe trips with us. So she'll come with us in the canoe. And then when we enter our first protected area, Dinosaur National Monument, dogs aren't allowed. So then she's going to go stay with a friend back up in Montana, because after that we'll be jumping in and out of protected areas all the way down. And she can't come to Mexico with us. Nice. That's my wife up there. Great, good questions. Yes?
What are some of the organizations that are partnering on this 50th anniversary initiative?
Yeah, so the other folks that are part of 5,000 Miles of Wild, the two main ones are American Rivers and American Whitewater. AW is a great organization that we work with quite often, and they focus more on the whitewater paddling community, but they focus on protecting wild rivers in the same way we do. We partner with them on a lot of different things. So we're the two main flagship organizations. And then there are a bunch of folks that are joining in various states. The National Outdoor Leadership School is one of them. They're educating all of their students over the next few years, actually, on a wild and scenic curriculum that we've helped them develop. And then there are a number of outdoor brands and outdoor industry folks too. But if you can think of other folks, so for instance, there are smaller river orgs too, like Idaho Rivers United is one of them over just across the way. And there are a bunch of other folks that are joining in. But there are a couple flagship ones. And then there's a large group that I mentioned earlier, which is all the land management agencies that manage wild and scenic rivers. So U.S. Forest Service, Bureau of Land Management, National Park Service, and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, along with American Rivers, American Whitewater, the River Network, Trout Unlimited, a whole bunch of different orgs are celebrating the 50th in this big interagency way as well. And there will be a bunch of events around that too. So, great. Good question. Yes, Vicki, and then I'll come down here.
The
Thanks for the great stories and also for all the great advocacy and action that you guys have gotten done. And I just want to mention that this is the 10-year anniversary of the removal of Milltown Dam.
Yes.
A big celebration on June 23 there, which I hope folks will come to. And there's also going to be a fundraiser on March 29th at Imagination Brewery to help pay for some new improvements there at the new park. So you'll have the opportunity to buy a tree or buy a bench for the park, something like, get together with a bunch of friends and buy a bench for the park.
Excellent. Thanks, Vicki. So June 23rd. June 23rd will be the anniversary celebration, the 10-year anniversary for the removal of Milltown Dam. So, restoring the Clark Fork to Wild River status. And then March 29th will be the fundraiser at Imagination Brewery. Come celebrate. You've got a local cause for Wild Rivers right here. Great, thanks. Yeah.
In these letters, the stories we're sending to our local folks, should we reference any particular legislation or just the general anniversary, or?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So there are a couple things that you could do. My view is that letters are always the most powerful when they speak to your own values. So if you speak to your congressional representative or your land manager about what you like and want to see maintained about your river, they can connect the dots to what they can put that towards. So that's huge. If you want to advocate for specific things, there are a bunch of them. The East Rosebud Creek Wild and Scenic Bill is in Congress right now. It's passed the Senate. It's introduced in the House. East Rosebud Creek flows off the Beartooth Plateau in the northeast side of Greater Yellowstone. It's a tributary of the Yellowstone River. And it's a special creek. It's been proposed for dams 3 different times and fought by locals for those times. And what they're hoping, and we're hoping, is that they don't have to make that fight for a 4th time, that it'll be designated and protected. So that's one that's out there right now. If you look up Montanans for Healthy Rivers, Montanans for Healthy Rivers is the coalition that American Rivers is part of, American Whitewater again, Greater Yellowstone Coalition, Backcountry Hunters and Anglers, Pacific Rivers Council. We're all on the steering committee. But then there are 1,000 different businesses across Montana, a number of different organizations that are part of it, and thousands of Montanans that have endorsed it. But if you look up Montanans for Healthy Rivers, there are a bunch of different local things that you can advocate for there as well, including more wild and scenic in different places. Good question, thanks. Yes?
How many of these 90,000 dams do you think are actually necessary?
90,000? Yeah, how many? So the question was, how many of the 90,000 dams are necessary? I'm not sure, to be honest. I'm sure some of them definitely are, though. We've been building dams in this country, or at least been measuring. I mean, we've been building dams since time memorial of one sense or another. But we've been measuring them since the early 1900s, late 1800s, monitoring them. Dams get relicensed now on a 50-year cycle. So every 50 years, a dam has to go through a really strict analysis and relicensing. And during that relicensing process, the company has to decide, is it worth enough to shore up the dam so it's not dangerous? I wish I could pull the stats off of my head, but you should look up the National Inventory of Dams. The Army Corps of Engineers maintains it. And they have not only the statistics that I rattled off, but they have a list of high threat, high hazard dams as well. And it's shockingly large. It's a significant percentage of our dams are considered high risk, high hazard. And that means they're in danger in some way of breaching and impacting folks downstream. And if you start digging too deeply into this, we've lost a number of them over the years and come close with a number more. But they get relicensed every 50 years. They get they don't get a stress test. They get a stress analysis. And then the company gets to decide, okay, can I bring these up to speed so that they're safe? And do they allow fish passage and meet modern environmental standards? Will we work with people for in-stream flows and in-stream flows for recreation and for wildlife, or is it cheaper to take it down? And sometimes they come on the side of it's cheaper to take it down, and that's when we start working with them. And as you can imagine, it's almost as expensive to take a dam down as it is to put up. Not quite, but it's a significant undertaking. But it's something that we work with folks on, and it can be a benefit for both the company that owns the dam and for the folks that want to see a free-flowing river. Good question. I didn't totally answer it, but it was a good question anyways. Yeah, Vicki.
The prediction of the impacts of climate change on river flows is higher highs and lower lows.
Correct.
So we're starting to hear people talk about, well, then we need more dams to store that high flow so that it doesn't flood, and then be able to meter it out during low flow. Are you starting to hear that sort of argument, that arguing for more dams because of climate change?
Yeah, we've heard some of that for sure. It comes up a lot. Interestingly, the whole idea of dams for flood control is underlaid by a number of faulty premises. As rivers get, so you can think of, I didn't mention this earlier, but rivers are considered free-flowing not only in the simple way like up and down rivers, that can be stopped by dams, but side to side as well. So rivers can lose their free-flowing status if they're hemmed in by riprap, by walls, by channelization. And the reason for that is that you can think of a healthy river system, unless it's flowing through something like the Grand Canyon, or really steep walled, in-sized canyons. Most of our rivers, when you see them in their floodplain, they're like a giant sponge. So rivers need room to be rivers, and it's not only up and downstream, it's side to side. So when floodwaters come, the rivers top their banks by design, and the surrounding vegetation and wetlands absorbs it. And in fact, a lot of our vegetation in Montana doesn't reproduce unless it gets that annual flood. Cottonwood trees would be one of those. So the big cottonwood galleries you see on the lower Yellowstone, the only reason those exist is because the Yellowstone's free-flowing. Cottonwood seedlings need floodwaters to germinate every year. A number of our songbirds, a number of our insects need that same thing. So when a river's functioning and when its wetlands are functioning, it's like a nice big sponge that it tops its banks, it absorbs all that water, and then some of that water soaks in and some of it runs back into the river across the land. But the stuff that soaks in becomes the groundwater that when people say, oh, that's a spring-fed river, it's fed by groundwater, that water just doesn't come from nowhere. Some of it comes from that river in flood stage, and then it's released later. So rivers do a really good job of mitigating floods themselves. When you have a dam or significant riprap, you don't dissipate that energy during a flood, you store it. So for those of you who have to go through physics class, you're storing kinetic energy, and you're storing a lot of it, a lot of potential energy. And it's a bargain, or it's a gamble to whether, have you built your infrastructure enough so that it can hold that kinetic energy or that potential energy, or is it going to top it or break it? So dams can prevent floods to a degree, but the risk is, it's an inexact science as to how much water they can hold. So when we get into trouble, last year, I'm blanking on the name of the dam in California. It's our tallest dam in the country. Oroville. We almost lost Oroville Dam. And Oroville Dam has been classified as a high hazard, dangerous dam for quite some time. We almost lost Oroville because of an inexact calculation of how much flood water was going to come down. So, like here in Montana, our water all comes from snowmelt. And this year we have a lot of snowmelt. And in a perfect world, that snow would melt slowly and carefully over the course of the summer until it was all gone and provide a nice trickling cold flow all the way through the summer. in reality, and especially in a climate-altered world, what we're going to get more of is snow that reaches the end of March or early April, and then all of a sudden we get a heat wave of 90 degrees and then it rains on that snowpack. And then all of the snowpack comes down at once. So what we had with Oroville Dam was, companies, especially, and for good reason, people rely on the water that comes out of Oroville. They don't want to let too much out because then they're just letting water out and they're not sure the snowmelt is going to fill behind it. So they let out enough that they think can absorb the floodwaters, but sometimes it comes faster than predicted. And the dam can only let so much out. These dams only have so many ways to shoot it out through the bottom of the dam, through penstocks, and otherwise they go through emergency spillways. But unfortunately, a lot of our emergency spillways were built on theory, not practice, and a lot of them don't hold up to the floodwater. In 1983, in that photo, the very first photo and story I showed you of the dory going over the gigantic wave in the Grand Canyon, we almost lost the Glen Canyon Dam. And it was operating under normal tolerances through the spillways, but the spillways had never been tested, And there were big chunks of concrete the size of houses being eroded out of there and shot out the spillway, and the dam almost went. Glen Canyon Dam, one of the largest dams we have in this country, they were preventing water from topping it with plywood put along the top. So, and again, I sound like I'm anti-dam or something, but I'm not. But I'm just saying that as we enter a climate-altered world, we're going to start seeing things that we never designed dams for and that we've never seen them handle before. Good question, Vicki. Yeah, there.
That's for you if you still want.
Yeah, do you? On the high hazard dams?
Yeah, speaking of snow melt,
Yeah, let's hear it.
there are 2,960 dams in Montana. Of that, 168 are listed as significant hazard, 195 as high hazard.
Wow. And that's just in Montana. Yeah, so 165 dams in Montana are significant hazard, 195 dams in Montana are high hazard, according to the National Inventory of Dams. Nice work, thanks. Yeah, up there.
I have a more river-specific question. I think at one time, correct me if I'm wrong, there was a push to get the Gallatin designated wild and scenic. Has that been shelved, or is that still in the works?
Yeah, there's still a significant push to designate the Gallatin. It's out of the rivers that Montans for Healthy Rivers Coalition is proposing. The Gallatin is one of the most popular. It's been endorsed by a number of businesses in Bozeman, all the major players up in Big Sky, up in the headwaters, and it's right on the cusp. Yeah, thanks for asking. The Gallatin's doing really well.
It's hard to believe that the Big Sky Chamber of Commerce is on board with that, but
Isn't that crazy? Yeah. And they are. Well, and it makes sense in a lot of ways. The Gallatin River, speaking of climate change, more and more people are going to be coming to Big Sky for things other than skiing. We've had a banner ski year this year, and we still are lucky enough to get good skiers in Montana. But the summer season gets longer and longer, and the key part of their summer season is the Gallatin River. So that's kind of the golden egg. Good question. Other questions? These are great. Yes?
Yeah, I'm kind of curious about the water rights. I grew up in East Roseville.
Oh, did you?
Right
Nice.
across it, yeah.
Excellent.
And of course, my family's agriculture and
Yep.
we irrigated and our water came,
Totally.
yeah. So just explain to me how that works, that they would have the water right part and how it doesn't impact agriculture. To me, it seems like it would somehow.
Yeah, so the question, if folks didn't hear it, was the water right piece, the Federal Reserve water right that's open to being filed for under the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. How does or doesn't that affect agriculture? And if it doesn't affect agriculture, why? Good question, and it's one that we get asked a lot. So I have two answers for that, and one of them is that when the act was crafted, it has specific savings clauses in it that protects private property. And part of that private property that the founders or the legislators wanted to protect was water rights. So the in-stream flow piece was meant to provide unallocated water to be reserved for in-stream flow in the river. But the key was the priority date of the date of designation. So for instance, with East Rosebud, if it passes in 2019, it's such a junior right that anyone that has filed for their water rights prior to 2019 gets their water before East Rosebud does. In that sense, you could say, well, that's not very powerful for protecting the river. And in the sense of water quantity, you'd be right. You know, all of these pieces of federal legislation have trade-offs, and that was a trade-off that was made in order to get it passed. So it'd have a very junior right. The other reason I'd say is that a lot of our current designations that we're seeing now are in headwaters streams. So oftentimes they're above a lot of the agricultural diversions. So the nice thing about East Rosebud, we have all of the agricultural landowners along there have either signed on or indicated that they don't oppose the designation. So, but that's a really good question because it's something that concerns people. You know, I talk a lot with ranchers and producers and folks that use their water rights for their livelihood. And one gentleman over a cup of coffee said, I'd rather talk to you about the pregnancy status of my daughter than the status of my water right. So, I mean, it was a very personal thing for him. So, but yeah, good question. Great. Other questions? Yeah.
What are some of the administrative protections that you were talking about earlier with?
Yeah, thanks for asking. That's a really good question. So the question was, what are some of the administrative protections that we talked about earlier versus the designation? So, you know, when a river is designated as wild and scenic, it has to pass both houses of Congress and be signed into law like by the president, like any other protective piece of legislation out there. Administrative designations would be, or administrative protections, would be working with land management agencies to get rivers protected as a special management area of one sort or another through forest plan revision, resource management plan revision, comprehensive river management plan revision, things like that. So oftentimes what we do is there's a piece of the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act that says that land management agencies, every time they update their land management plan, need to inventory all of the eligible wild and scenic rivers or wild and scenic streams in their area. So they have to look and document every stream that is free-flowing and has at least one of those outstandingly remarkable values. And if it has at least one outstandingly remarkable value and it's free-flowing, it's considered wild and scenic eligible. And then administratively, it needs to be protected as such, unless it's found at a later date to be non-suitable for that protection, which we can talk about later. But basically, it's not as powerful of a protection as a congressional designation, but the agency will weigh that in its land management planning and in the future projects that it considers to keep that river hopefully in its free-flowing status. It can, when there's a project that's proposed that would potentially run counter to that, they can take a hard look at it and see if it warrants that protection in the future with public comment. And that's called a suitability determination. But they need to take a hard look. Good questions. Yeah.
Since we have all these river lovers here together, and since a great way to protect rivers from climate change is to increase the amount of renewable energy that our electric utilities are required to produce, there is a citizen ballot initiative called I-184 that calls for that, increasing the amount of renewable energy that electric utilities. So if you are a registered voter and you would like to sign, I've got the petitions here. We have to get 30,000 signatures to get that on the ballot. So just before you leave tonight, if you'd like to try to make that happen.
So go see Vicki. If you don't know her, this is Professor Vicki Watson. And she's not only a professor in the Environmental Studies Department, but one of the best active citizens that I know. Other questions? Yes, sir.
So a while back, I read the story of the designation of the North Fork of the Flathead.
Yeah.
And it seems like there were different aspects of that. There was the designation, which provides some protections, but there were some other things going on in Canada and the adjacent lands. Are you familiar with that story? And can you talk about how you guys probably have to work with partners to further protect rivers?
Yeah, so the question was about the North Fork of the Flathead and about the designation up there and working with Canada and potentially other partners up there. So the North Fork of the Flathead, for those who aren't familiar with it, it flows down the eastern side of Glacier National Park, and it actually starts in Canada. The North Fork Valley is actually a transboundary valley. And I don't know about the designation itself. I don't know the story behind that and kind of the transnational piece. But I do know that the North Fork Watershed Protection Act, which we worked on a handful of years ago, was aimed at protecting the wild and scenic North Fork River from coal mining effluent up in the headwaters, particularly selenium, which is toxic to fish. And that was through the State Department and through a Transboundary Commission and through negotiations with Teck Coal up there in Canada. Yeah, it took a while. So actually the Canadians signed their version of the North Fork Watershed Protection Act before we signed ours, even though it was pushed from down here, and it was a little bit of a race to get that done and make sure that we upheld our end of the bargain. It's helped up there a lot. There's still some issues on some transboundary rivers like that. The North Fork's doing quite well. Some of the others like the Kootenai and the Elk and stuff are not for some of the same reasons. But I don't know if that's what you're alluding to. Okay. Yeah, great. So yeah, transboundary rivers pose another problem. We're getting down to the wire here. One more question maybe, and then we should probably wrap it up. Great. Thanks. Appreciate it, y'all.